This is Lori Prox. We're here with Bill Comer, Police Chief for Valdez, talking about drug and alcohol use among minors and the Valdez Police Department's uptick here in Valdez of incidences involving youth, and in particular high school students here at Valdez High School involved with either marijuana and or alcohol. Can you characterize, is it more alcohol related? Is it more marijuana?
You know, it is hard to characterize, and drugs in the face of drug use and drug abuse is really changing. There's bath salts. Everybody has heard about that now, and that's real scary. There's spice, different almost household substances that are being abused now that are really a lot of concern. Another big concern is prescription drugs that you can find in almost any house, where from Valium and Adderall, Ritalin, Percocet, just those kind of prescription drugs are being used, and it's very, very hard to detect especially when they're used in low doses, but they can still be behavior altering and give that euphoric feeling of a high to kids, and you might just assume that they're just being silly or just being kids, and you wouldn't realize that. And it's very difficult for detection. And
it's easy. You break up a big party up at Mineral Creek, and there's a case of beer and a whole bunch of kids standing around. That one you can draw the conclusion. But when you have things going on, and I know recently there have been kids going out during lunch period at the high school, and I know a few instances where kids have been picked up for marijuana usage during a lunch period. So those kids presumably going back to school. What is the process to identify a child that may be under the influence? What can you do when you suspect a child is under the influence? What rights do you have to test that child? And then how does that differ once you get into the schools or during school hours? How's that handled differently?
I think the teachers have a baseline. They're with the children every day. They know how they behave when typically when they're not under any influence. They would be able to have a good baseline of what behavior is typically when they're doing their schoolwork, where officers don't. Their contact are pretty infrequent and random, and so I would say it's more difficult for an officer to know what a baseline is or what a child's personality is, whether they're generally just silly or more forward than what they're used to.
So when a teacher does find a student like that, do you get the call?
Sometimes.
How often has that happened? This year we have all these cases, and we know, had these kids not been caught, they would have presumably been back at school under the influence of marijuana. So how many calls have you gotten from the school?
Lori, I don't know that answer. We've got some calls from the school, and sometimes it's letting us know that they suspect that there's some drug use going on, and then and we look into it. The school has its own process for dealing with that, and so I don't have those figures. It would take some work for me to figure out how many times exactly the school has called us, but it's not uncommon for the school to call us and say, hey, we think that this has happened, or somebody has said this. We don't know for sure. We're looking into it. And oftentimes they handle that administratively. Sometimes we get involved with it, depending on to the extent that behavior is gone on or the evidence that they've found.
The discussion at the school board meeting the other night was really wondering whether the teachers needed training to identify students under the influence, whether there was an issue with teachers not reporting it, either due to being afraid of being wrong, being afraid of something not happening with that. Do you think there's enough reporting of this right now? And if not, why not?
I think that teachers are there to teach, and they go in with the assumption that their kids are there to learn, and that it's the process. And adding more training for them to detect drug use, that's a difficult thing for a teacher, and that is you mentioned for fear of being wrong. Certainly.
A serious concern. That's a tough one.
I mean, if you're a child or you're a parent and your child was falsely accused of being under the influence of either some drugs or alcohol, undoubtedly you're going to be upset. So teachers, just like police officers, are going to want to make sure that before they make any allegations that they're right on, because the downside is pretty substantial to making those kind of accusations.